The Canada-US border, stretching an astounding 5,125 miles, holds the title of the longest international boundary in the world. To put it into perspective, this border is longer than a round trip from New York to London. Even more fascinating, it traverses an incredible diversity of landscapes. On its eastern edge, the border begins at the Atlantic Ocean, winding through dense forests and rugged highlands. Moving westward, it cuts across the iconic Great Lakes. Yes, that includes Niagara Falls. This natural marvel is part of the border's journey as it weaves through rivers and dozens of smaller lakes before reaching the famous 49th parallel. But this line isn't just a straight path through farmland. When it meets the Rockies, the terrain transforms dramatically, with the border passing through alpine forests and snow-capped peaks. Further west, it navigates lush rainforests and coastal mountain ranges before finally reaching the Pacific. And don't forget Alaska. Up north, the border snakes through towering mountain ranges and vast river valleys, creating some of the continent's most breathtaking scenery. This border is far more than a line on a map. It's a journey through North America's most vivid and awe-inspiring landscapes. Canada, a massive country spanning 3.85 million square miles, ranks as the second largest nation globally, nearly 1.6 times the size of its southern neighbor, the United States. Yet, despite its vast size, one surprising fact stands out. Approximately 80% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the U.S. border. This means most Canadians are concentrated along the southern edge, while much of the northern expanse remains sparsely populated. The northern regions of Canada evoke images of an expansive and untouched wilderness, dominated by vast forests, mountains, and icy tundra. Moving south, especially near cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, population density rises sharply. These urban centers are Canada's economic and cultural hubs, strategically located near the U.S. border, fostering close economic and cultural exchanges between the two nations. Why is this the case? One key reason lies in the milder climate of the southern regions, which is more conducive to trade and agriculture, making it a better environment for settlement. In contrast, the further north you go, the harsher the climate and more rugged the terrain, creating increasingly challenging living conditions. This stark contrast highlights the irony that while Canada is vast and resource-rich, many Canadians choose to live on a relatively small strip of land near the border. Population distribution. Harsh climates and complex terrains have driven settlement near the southern border. Cities like Vancouver and Toronto have emerged as economic hubs thanks to their favorable trade routes and milder climates. In Canada, despite its expansive territory, the majority of people cluster near the U.S. border. This pattern is deeply influenced by geography and climate. Northern regions, particularly the Canadian Shield, present challenging conditions for settlement and agriculture due to their rocky terrain, cold climate, and heavy snowfall. These factors make large-scale settlement and farming difficult. Consequently, most Canadians reside in more temperate, fertile areas closer to the border. Take Vancouver and Toronto, for instance. Both cities benefit from warmer climates and proximity to key trade routes, establishing themselves as economic and commercial centers. Vancouver, located on the Pacific coast, leverages its exceptional port facilities as an international trade hub. Meanwhile, Toronto, Canada's largest city, sits by Lake Ontario, with convenient waterways and railway systems, making it a focal point of economic activity. Not only are these cities the most prosperous regions in Canada, but their relatively moderate climate with distinct seasons also attract a significant population and business presence. These cities' growth owes much to their advantageous geographic positions. Unlike Canada's colder or harder to develop regions, Vancouver and Toronto historically became magnets for immigrants and merchants because of their proximity to the U.S. border and excellent transportation networks. Being near the U.S. has also enhanced these cities' global trade connections, especially with Asia, fueling sustained economic growth. While Canada's northern regions remain vast and sparsely populated, its southern border areas have become densely concentrated hubs of economic and population activity. When discussing geography, the Canada-US border is undeniably remarkable, featuring stunning landmarks. From North America's most magnificent natural landscapes, this border feels like a guided tour through the continent's highlights. Starting with the Great Lakes, these massive freshwater bodies not only supply drinking water to millions, but also serve as a natural divider between the two nations. From the rugged shores of Lake Superior to the Thousand Islands of Lake Ontario, this region is among the most scenic border areas in the world. Heading west, the Pigeon River adds an enchanting touch as it forms a waterway boundary between Minnesota and Ontario. Here, the border crosses over 100 lakes, creating a striking blue mosaic on the map. Next comes the legendary 49th parallel, a boundary so distinct it's visible from space. That's right, this stretch of border carves a straight line through forests and plains, showcasing a stark contrast between untamed wilderness and meticulously defined human boundaries. And we can't forget the iconic landmarks that rise along this border. Montana's Glacier National Park and Alberta's Waterton Lakes National Park together form an international peace park, a tapestry of dramatic peaks, crystal clear lakes, and alpine meadows. Then there's Vancouver Island, a Pacific gem entirely within Canadian territory but geographically tied to the border's story. These highlights not only define the border, they make it unforgettable. Cultural and historical connections. The United States and Canada share historical roots deeply embedded in European settlement, especially from British and French immigrants. Imagine waves of settlers crossing the Atlantic from Europe centuries ago, bringing their culture, religion, and traditions to North America. Over time, their histories intertwined, particularly through the interaction and sometimes conflict with the indigenous peoples of these lands, shaping today's geography. One prominent example is the Blackfoot people, an indigenous nation whose lands span the Canada-US border. To this day, they maintain close ties across the border, viewing themselves as one united people. Their cross-border identity underscores their deep connection to this land, regardless of national boundaries. For early European settlers, waterways like the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River served as key entry points. Why? Because in the absence of railroads and highways, waterways were the easiest modes of transportation. Settlers established trading posts and cities along these routes, fostering trade with local indigenous tribes, especially in furs. The fertile soils around the Great Lakes also supported agriculture, making the region a hub for economic and population growth. The St. Lawrence River, in particular, became a vital gateway to the Atlantic. It enabled Canada to maintain close ties with the world, especially Europe. Cities like Montreal and Quebec City flourished due to their advantageous locations, becoming major centers of commerce and culture. In essence, the cultural and historical connections between the United States and Canada are rooted in the early settlers' journeys and their complex interactions with indigenous nations. This shared history continues to shape the two countries' relationship, as well as the border and cultural landscape we see today. Some parts of the U.S. Canada border are truly geographical marvels, leaving people in awe. Let's start with Derby Line, Vermont, a prime example of the art of border delineation. This small town is literally split in half by the international border, even cutting through buildings. The most famous example is the Haskell Free Library and Opera House. The building's entrance is in the US, but its bookshelves and reading room are in Canada. Imagine crossing an international border just by walking from one room to another. Simple, yet romantic. However, since 9/11, stricter security measures have made this cross-border experience less casual. Next, let's look at the Northwest Angle in Minnesota, a geographical tale of the border. This small exclave of the US, located north of the 49th parallel and surrounded on all sides by Canada, owes its peculiar shape to an 18th century cartographic error. After treaties were signed, it was discovered that the maps were incorrect, leaving this tiny area isolated. Today, residents either travel by boat or cross through Canada to reach the rest of the US. Lastly, there's Point Roberts in Washington State, another small exclave that poses logistical headaches. The 49th parallel slices through the Sawasan Peninsula, leaving this southern tip as an isolated piece of U.S. territory. To access mainland Washington, residents must first pass through Canadian territory. Daily life here, commuting, attending school, or shopping requires frequent border crossings, making cross-border living a unique reality. The U.S.-Canada border's peculiarities are rooted in historical disputes and treaties. The 1783 Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolutionary War, used vague descriptions and crude maps, leading to disputes in the oddly shaped main border. The 1846 Oregon Treaty established much of the 49th parallel boundary, but ambiguities in its wording led to the Pig War over the San Juan Islands. While the conflict never escalated into actual war, negotiations ultimately awarded the islands to the U.S. Maine's border issues culminated in the Aroostook War during the 1830s and 1840s. This mostly bloodless conflict, characterized by threats and negotiations, was resolved by the 1842 Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which adjusted the border to follow rivers and ridges, resulting in its current intricate shape. These historical events not only shape the US Canada border, but also reflect the geopolitical stakes and intense competition for resources at the time. Today, these borders serve as historical markers while also connecting the two nations' cultures and communities. In remote areas, the border reveals extraordinary stories of integration and cross-border ties. Take Hyder, Alaska, for example. This small town may be part of the US on a map, but its lifestyle is almost entirely intertwined with Canada. Residents use Canadian currency, dial area code 250 for British Columbia instead of Alaska's 907, and follow Canadian Pacific Time rather than Alaska time. They even enthusiastically celebrate Canada Day on July 1st each year. This unique dynamic makes the border here a mere formality. Hyder is closely connected to the nearby Canadian town of Stewart, with residents relying heavily on its stores and services. This blurring of boundaries exemplifies a harmonious, symbiotic relationship between the two nations. Moving east to Campobello Island in New Brunswick, the situation is reversed. This Canadian island is accessible only via a bridge connecting it to the US state of Maine. For essentials like groceries, medical care, and mail services, residents often have no choice but to cross into the US. This reliance has sparked growing calls for a bridge directly linking the island to mainland Canada. The current ferry service operates only during the warmer months, leaving residents vulnerable to harsh winter weather that makes crossings dangerous or impossible. This dependency on the US highlights the challenges of cross-border living and makes Campobello Island a microcosm of international cooperation. These places illustrate the unique charm of the US-Canada border. While national boundaries are clearly defined, the lines of daily life are far more flexible, offering a vivid testament to the enduring friendship between the two countries. When it comes to the peculiarities of the US-Canada border, quirky crossing points truly leave people amazed. First, let's talk about East Richford Road in Vermont. This seemingly ordinary rural road is mostly within the US, but wait, at one spot it crosses the border into Canada for about 100 feet before slipping back into the US. Here's the kicker, there's no customs checkpoint. Yes, you can drive onto Canadian soil and then quietly return to the US. Don't get any ideas about heading straight to Montreal, though. This stretch is more of a border oddity than a practical route. Still, it's enough to excite map enthusiasts and adventurers alike. Now for something even more curious, borders that cut through buildings and roads. Imagine sipping coffee in your living room while gazing at an American view, only to step into your bedroom and find yourself in Canada. This isn't science fiction. In places like Derby Line, it's reality. The most iconic example is the Haskell Free Library and Opera House. Its front door is in the US, but its bookshelves sit in Canada. Although this arrangement was originally meant to symbolize friendship between the two nations, stricter border controls after 9/11 have complicated this seamless cross-border experience. These crossing points, though small in scale, highlight the fascinating quirks of the US-Canada border. They're not just geographical coincidences, but also symbols of intertwined histories and cultures, reminding us that borders can divide territories, but also connect hearts. Indigenous communities and cross-border challenges. Some indigenous communities along the US-Canada border face unique legal and cultural challenges. For example, the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation straddles both countries, with its land crossing the borders of New York, Quebec, and Ontario. For these residents, the border is more than a political line. It deeply impacts their daily lives and cultural identity. Akwesasne is a transnational community where people frequently cross the border for school, healthcare, or shopping. This constant cross-border movement poses challenges to their cultural and personal identity, as they are both American and Canadian citizens, yet their heritage is rooted in the land that predates the border's existence. This unique situation also creates legal and administrative hurdles. Residents must navigate two distinct legal systems, dealing with differences in taxation, healthcare, and education policies. Moreover, managing land resources and preserving cultural heritage across two nations' jurisdictions adds layers of complexity. Exclaves and isolated communities. The border has also created several unique exclaves and isolated communities caught between the US and Canada. Point Roberts, Washington is a classic example. This tiny American exclave is entirely surrounded by Canada, requiring residents to cross the border for most of their daily activities. Similar communities exist along the border, facing the logistical and social challenges of living between two countries. A border without military defense. Despite its quirks, one of the most astonishing aspects of the US-Canada border is its lack of military fortifications. Globally, this is rare. Few other international borders operate solely on mutual trust and cooperation. The U.S. and Canada share the world's longest undefended border, underscoring the strength of their peaceful relationship. Imagine a border this long without walls or heavily armed patrols. Instead, it's built on trust and collaboration, whether in cultural exchanges, economic partnerships, or shared stances on global issues. This undefended border reflects a nearly conflict-free relationship, serving as a model of peaceful coexistence. This also highlights how the border is not merely a political divide, but a link connecting the two countries. Every year, millions of Americans and Canadians cross it to attend family gatherings, work, travel, and more. Modern border dynamics. Even after 9/11 led to stricter border security, the bond between the U.S. and Canada remains strong. Border states like Michigan and Washington, despite more rigorous inspections and procedures, maintain close economic ties. Each year, billions of dollars in goods and millions of travelers cross this world's longest undefended border. From U.S. auto manufacturers working with Canadian parts suppliers to technology collaborations between Washington State and Canada, the two economies are deeply integrated. Meanwhile, demographic shifts have added complexity. Canada's low birth rate and aging population create challenges for its labor market. With an average age of 41 compared to the US's 38, Canada faces a shrinking workforce, especially in remote areas. Many young Canadians move south in search of better opportunities, subtly reshaping border dynamics. Despite these trends, Canadian cities near the border, with lower living costs and proximity to the US market, attract immigrants. Meanwhile, the US's higher birth rate and younger population drive economic growth in border regions. These shifts suggest that future border relations will become even more intertwined, economically, culturally, and demographically. A shared history and its significance. The shared history of the US and Canada has forged deep cultural, economic, and geographical connections. Early European settlers from Britain, France, and Spain brought common cultural roots that laid the foundation for close ties between the two nations. While the US gained independence and Canada remained a British colony, their interactions never ceased. The border, as it evolved, was shaped by these long-standing interactions, reflecting shared challenges and opportunities, particularly in trade and economics. Geography has also played a crucial role. The border runs through resource-rich regions, making it a hub for cross-border trade and cooperation. Many Canadian and American cities, such as Toronto and Vancouver, thrive near the border, benefiting from economic exchange and cultural interaction. This intertwined history not only shaped the border itself, but also influenced the cultural and economic landscape of both nations. From colonial disputes to treaty negotiations, every historical milestone has pushed the US and Canada toward greater cooperation and competition. Today, the US-Canada border is not just a line dividing two nations, but a bridge uniting them through shared history, culture, and economic collaboration.